This week's Torah portion is called Toldot. We continue with the family dynamics that go on between our forefathers and our foremothers. Last week, we read about the death of Abraham and Sarah. Sarah first, then Abraham. And now we're continuing through the lineage with Isaac. This week's Torah portion is mostly about Isaac. It's bridge between Abraham and Jacob, who's going to continue the lineage of who the Jewish people are founded from. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are our forefathers. Their wives are our foremothers, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. And they are the people who set down for us certain character traits, certain ways of being in the world, certain foundations which we can draw on to be the best we can be in the world. So when we say our morning prayers, when we say our prayers, actually the foundational prayer we have is called the Shemona Esrei, the Amida, the standing prayer. We say that we are talking to the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So who are these people, and why is it important that we represent ourselves as their descendants? Abraham represented kindness in the world. He was the epitome and the embodiment and the personification of kindness and giving and love in the world. And he put that down into the foundation. And that's one of the foundations of the world is kindness. And so we can draw on that. We can be that. We can be an Abraham and Sarah. Every forefather has a foremother. So when we speak about Abraham, we're really talking about Abraham and Sarah. When we talk about Isaac, we're also talking about Isaac and Rebekah, his wife. And Isaac represented and put down into the foundation of the world this idea of strength and self-sacrifice. We read a couple of weeks ago about the binding of Isaac and how he's willing to give up his life. This idea of self-sacrifice, the idea of serving God, the idea of having strength and boundaries. Gevura is the Kabbalistic term for this energy, this strength that Isaac puts into the world, and he brings Rivka into his tent and they become a partnership, and the two of them represent this personal integrity and capacity for self-sacrifice. That's what they lay down into the foundation of the Jewish people. And finally, Jacob, who is the man of the tents, the man who's learning, the man who's wise, the man who's insights. He represents Torah and wisdom and purity. So in our tradition, it teaches us that the world is founded as the foundations, three pillars on which it stands. It stands on kindness, on strength, and on service to God, and on learning, and on Torah. And these are represented and laid down into the world by our forefathers and our foremothers. So we evoke them. We are their descendants. That's who we are. So in this book of Genesis, we're reading about these families. We're reading about our forefathers and our foremothers and how they lived and what lessons we can draw from them. In this week's Torah portion, Isaac and Rebekah are barren. They're unable to have children. They pray. And again, we have this miraculous birth of twins born to Rebekah and Isaac. Their names are Jacob and Esau. And it says many different commentaries on what kinds of children they were, that they had a certain innate character traits, that Jacob was the man of the tent. He was more intellectual. He was more studious. He was smooth-skinned. And Esau was the man of the field. He was more materialistic and more rugged and more out in the world, kind of innate qualities that he had. And only when they became older did that start to then manifest. But we're told that Rebekah loved Jacob. But we're also taught that Isaac loved Esau. And he loved Esau because game was in his mouth, that Esau would go into the fields and kill venison and kill meat and bring that to his father. And many of our commentators talk about it as some kind of a conditional love. It was a love that was conditional on this giving of food to Isaac. Whether or not that's true, or whether there are other commentators commentaries to explain why it was that this is the terminology in the Torah, that Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob. But either way, you have what's set up here, what looked like conditional versus unconditional love, that Rebekah loved Jacob just unconditionally, And you have also an idea that there was favoritism, that one child was favored over the other. And so that, we can tease that apart and say that's not the way that we want to parent. We want all our children to feel loved by us. We want all of us as children to be loved by both of our parents, and not because of anything conditional, just because we are. And I think it gets to the crux of this sense of who it is that we are, and can we be authentically ourselves. So in the story, as the story of the four mothers and four fathers unfolds, what we learn is that Isaac gets to be 123. Last week we read that his mother died at 127. So within a 5-year space between our lives and that of the parent who died the earliest is a sense of our own mortality. When you come within 5 years of the death of your parent who dies first, there's a sense that that's your cap. That's as old as you'll get, and you start to face your own mortality in a way that you don't when you're younger. And here's Isaac. He's within 5 years of the death of his mother, and he's like, I'm getting to be an old man now. Now I recognize I'm within that 5 years span of when my mother died. I'm beginning to feel my mortality, and so he brings Esau, his oldest son, who he loves because the game was in his mouth, it says in the Torah, brings him, says, get me some food, I want to eat, and I want to bless you. I want to give you the blessing. The firstborn blessing is going to go to you. Rivka hears this. She had a prophecy that really the blessing should go to Jacob. So she gets Jacob. She pulls Jacob in, and she dresses him up. She convinces him to deceive the elderly, blind father Isaac, to deceive him into thinking that he, Jacob, dressed up as Esau is really Esau. So he puts on the clothing of Esau, which our Medrash tells us was the clothing of Adam in the Garden of Eden. It smelled of the Garden of Eden. He puts on the clothing of Esau, which was the clothing of Adam in the Garden of Eden. Puts on this clothing, puts fur on his arms. He goes in and he declares himself to be Esau. And he deceives Isaac into giving him the blessing. So there's a lot of commentary on this, but there's throughout the stories that we're going to read as we go through the more and more of the Torah stories, there's going to be more deception and more deception. But this is the first appearance of deception. Esau deceived his father by asking questions, by doing things that portrayed him in a different light than he really was. You could argue that. But what we're seeing here in stark detail, the Torah is telling us in stark detail how it is that Jacob deceives Isaac into getting this blessing for the firstborn. And that gets set down. But what I want to pull out is, how do we show up? Do we show up? Are we seen for who we are? Do we have to hide who we are? Are we embarrassed by who we are? Will we not get the blessing from our parent if we show up as our authentic selves? And again, taking it out of this Torah portion and saying just in our own lives, we want to be seen as children. We want our parents to see us for who we are. We want them to understand who we are. We want them to love us for who we are. We don't want to hide. We want to present ourselves in our authentic selves. Like little children, they are loved. But as we get older, we start to put up barriers. We start to put up things that push people away, and maybe we're not so known. But I think there's a deep desire to want to be loved for who we are, just because we're the children of our parents. We want them to love us innately, unconditionally. And what we're seeing in this story is that Jacob is hiding who he is in order to pretend to be Esau. He brings game with him. Maybe if I bring game, perhaps, says Jacob, if I bring the game like my brother Esau, maybe then my father will see me, my father will love me. But he's not loving Jacob. He's loving something conditional. And so maybe in our own lives, as we think about the people that we want to be in relationship with, we really don't want to hide. We don't want to have to not show parts of ourselves because we're embarrassed or ashamed, or we don't think that we're worthy. We want to be able to show up and be authentic and be real and be loved for who we are. And I think that it's sad. And actually, when we, in many of the commentators, Isaac and Jacob are portrayed as diametric opposites. One represents goodness and the line of the Jewish people. Jacob, that's where we're going to go, continue with the line of Jacob, and Esau is represented as this evil man of the field who's like deceptive and deceiving and is not good. But there are a couple of episodes just to paint him as a little bit more of a real live person, where he shows his humanity. One is at the beginning, where he comes out of the field and Jacob is making this stew. It's a lentil stew that Jacob's making, and the understanding is that Jacob and Esau had just come back from the funeral of Abraham, their grandfather. And Esau is exhausted because it was so emotional for him, because he had such a strong bond with his grandfather Abraham. So there's a sense of compassion you have for Esau, because he's exhausted from mourning his grandfather Abraham. And that this pottage, this soup that Jacob is making, is the soup of condolence. It's after a funeral. It's made out of lentils. It's a soup that he's making for his father Isaac after the funeral of Abraham. So that's one place where we see the humanity of Esau. And the second place is when he comes in after Jacob has left and has received this blessing that was supposed to go to that goes to the firstborn, went to Jacob. Esau comes in and they recognize that a deception had occurred, and it says in the Torah that Esau cries bitterly, weeping. He's crying out that he didn't get the blessing. He wanted the blessing, and he's mourning the loss of that blessing, and he cries bitterly, again showing his humanity. So as much as he can be painted as all bad and this cosmic force of evil in the world, there's two incidences in this week's Torah portion, one when he comes back from the funeral of Abraham, and this one where he's bereft of the blessing that he wanted from his father, from his beloved father, that he doesn't get that blessing, and he cries out. So here we see a little bit of humanity. But I want to just leave us with a question, and the question is, how do we show up in our relationships? Are we able to show who we are? Are we able to love ourselves such that we can show up and be love for who we are and not pretend to be something that we are not?